I think what stood out for me the most out of the report was how much government spends on compensation for the employee. And you said 90% of government's budget goes to compensation of employees. And I was asking about sustainability of these numbers.
Well, the government has made very strategic use of its payroll. 40% of high-skilled black South Africans are now employed by the South African government. Representing about 1.2 million people on the government payroll. Government employee compensation is now just about 90% of total government spending. I suppose in a cynical way you could say government's budget is being used to keep an important political constituency in the middle class. I think there is some aspect of that.
How sustainable are these numbers, though? Because I think one of the things that we've seen, we keep on talking about what's happening in Greece, and it's not just Greece. There are 3 other countries other than Greece that are facing this issue of huge public spending. And this is something they did years ago, decades ago, and now they're having to pay for it. Can we see at these numbers that perhaps we could probably be suffering the same fate at some point?
I think in total the government budget has been very much under control. We've had very moderate fiscal policies in South Africa. So there's no reason to think our debt levels are low, our budget deficit is low as a percentage of GDP. I think we're in a very favorable fiscal position. So in principle these figures are sustainable, but I think the problem is much needed infrastructure investment by government has been relegated to the sidelines. And you see that in all sorts of ways. You see that in the collapse of Eskom, you see that in the collapse of the rail infrastructure and Transnet, you see that in very poor infrastructure investments in telecommunications by Telkom. You see it in service delivery protests in the local and provincial government sphere. So perhaps these are not politically sustainable, but economically the government budget in total is still well within international bounds.
Something else that you found was income inequality declining sharply in the past decade. What is the significance of that, particularly here in South Africa?
To me, this is a very important result. I think there are laws at NEDLAC at the moment that would seek to criminalize send company directors to jail for failing to meet employment equity targets. I think government is missing the point. Incomes are rising for black and white South Africans, and income disparities are narrowing very dramatically. We estimate that if the last decade's trend continues, white and black incomes in South Africa will have converged within 7 years. But government remains fixated on the number of black South Africans in management. And that is a tragic emphasis on government's part, because South Africa is short of about 820,000 high-skilled people in the private sector, most of whom are in senior management. So it's really just not possible to reduce income inequality through managerial promotions. It's just not practical. But nonetheless, the number of black South Africans earning higher incomes in the civil service, but also in the private sector as professionals, managers and so on, has been rising. So I think that's a very positive development. It means that populist laws like the one being proposed at NEDLAC to criminalize failing to meet employment equity targets is probably unnecessary economically.
You do have recommendations, though, that you think might work, and one of the things that you talk about 3 things: secondary schooling, review of labor laws, and immigration controls. And you say that immigration controls in particular are holding back black incomes. What do you mean by that?
Well, if we take those 3 in turn, the most important is secondary schooling. The collapse of government education has done more than anything else to slow down the pace of advance in black incomes in South Africa. A poor standard of schooling, very low standards for matriculation, very few numbers of people, black South Africans in particular, joining the tertiary education system. All of those suppress black wages. So I think a major unintended consequence of the collapse of secondary education has been to keep black incomes low. Immigration at the same time immigration controls have accelerated income inequalities. White South Africans who tend to have tertiary education, university educations, etc., they've been dramatically helped by immigration controls. We have very little competition among high-skilled professionals and managers from foreign workers. And as a result, white incomes have been rising much faster than black incomes because of these immigration controls. And then finally, labor laws. I mean, probably the most important reason why black and white incomes are not converging is that a large number of people remain unemployed, typically black youth under the age of 24. So I think we need to look at those labor laws that impact small businesses, who are 68% of job creators in the country. And the things they complain about are dismissal protections. You can't manage a workforce's productivity if you don't have a credible sanction for that workforce if they fail to perform. And at the same time, we have issues in collective bargaining agreements between big businesses, sometimes representing as little as 10% of the total workforce in an industry. Those are automatically extended to non-parties, and that's probably unconstitutional, but it's certainly uneconomical.